My Stepson handed me an envelope at his mother's funeral. I thought it was a sympathy card. It was a 30-day eviction notice for the house I built with my own 2 hands. He didn't even wait until the dirt was settled. My wife was 3 hours in the ground. The casseroles were still warm on the kitchen counter, and Derek pulled me aside by the coat closet, pressed that envelope into my hand, and said, quiet enough that the other mourners wouldn't hear, "Mom's gone now. Russ, it's time you understood how things really are. How things really are." I stood there in my good black suit, the one Maggie ironed for me the last week. She was strong enough to stand at an ironing board, and I opened that envelope, and I read it twice, because the words didn't make sense the first time. 30 days to vacate the property. The property. He met my home. The home I built. They thought they had me beaten. They thought 30 days was all I had left in the only home I'd ever built. They were so sure they were right that they never checked the one thing that could destroy their entire plan. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Russell Calloway. People call me Russ. I'm 65 years old, and I live in a craftsman house at the end of a gravel road outside Hollis, North Carolina, with a front porch I cut and sanded and joined by hand in the summer of 1986. I've been a quiet man my whole life. Not weak, not soft, quiet. There's a difference. And the boy I raised as my own spent 30 years confusing the two. By the time he learned which one I really was, he'd already made the worst bet of his life. Let me tell you about that house, because the house is the whole story. I was a carpenter. 38 years, my own 2 hands, building other people's homes all over these mountains. Decks and kitchens and whole houses from a hole in the ground up to the ridge cap. And back in 1985, I took every dollar I'd saved since. I was 19 and bought 4 acres of wooded land at the end of that gravel road. I built the house myself over the next 2 years, weekends and evenings after paying jobs, framing it alone in the cold, hauling my own lumber, setting every window. I wasn't building it for anyone in particular. I was a single man building a home because a man ought to have a home he made. And then, in 1986, with the house half finished and the roof finally on, I met Margaret. Maggie was a widow with a 7-year-old boy. Her first husband had run off and then died somewhere out west, and she was raising that little boy alone, working double shifts at the diner in town, and she was the strongest and kindest person I had ever laid eyes on. We married within the year, and I brought her and her son Derek up that gravel road to the house I'd built, and I told that little boy, "You've got a home now, son. A real one. For good." I meant it with everything in me, and for 30 years I tried to live up to it. I want to be fair about Derek, because the easy thing would be to tell you he was always rotten. It's not that simple, and the truth matters more than the easy version. I raised that boy as my own from the age of 7. I taught him to ride a bike on that gravel road. I coached his little league. I worked an extra job the year he wanted braces, and I never told him why I was tired. I walked him into his first day of school, and I walked him down the aisle when he got married because his own father was long dead, and I was the only father he'd ever had. I paid for his college, every dime. I never once made him feel like he owed me for it. I'll give you one memory. so you understand what was at stake. When Derek was 9, he wanted to build a birdhouse for the science fair, and he wanted to do it himself, with real tools like I used. So I cleared off the kitchen table, and I showed him how to measure twice and cut once, and his little hands could barely work the clamp, and we stayed up past his bedtime, the two of us, sawdust all over Maggie's clean floor, and when it was done it was crooked as a country road, and he held it up like it was made of gold. Maggie took a picture. That picture sat on our mantel for 26 years. He won nothing at the science fair, but that night the boy who used to flinch when I came in a room fell, asleep on the couch, leaning against my arm, and I sat there not moving for an hour so I wouldn't wake him, and I thought, I will spend the rest of my life earning this. That crooked birdhouse is still in my workshop. I couldn't throw it out. I think you'll understand why that matters later when I tell you what he did. But somewhere in there, a coldness lived in Derek that I could never reach. A little distance he kept, like a door always left an inch open to the weather. When he was angry as a teenager, he had a way of saying it. "You're not my real dad." It cut every time, but I understood it, a boy's grief looking for a place to land, and I forgave it every time. What I didn't understand, not until that funeral, was that he'd never really stopped believing it. To Derek, in the deepest part of him, I was always the man who married his mother, the house guest who stayed 30 years. And the day his mother died, the house guest's welcome ran out. His wife didn't help. Brooke came into the picture about 10 years back, and Brooke had opinions about money, and about what was owed, and about how a 4-acre property at the end of a gravel road in a town that was starting to attract retirees was worth a great deal more than the old man living on it understood. I'm not going to pretend I know everything that was said in their house, but I know the eviction notice was typed on nice paper, and I know Brooke is the one in that family who knows how to make things look official. Maggie got sick 2 years ago. I'm not going to walk you through those 2 years, because some things a man keeps for himself, but I'll tell you I built a ramp to the front porch with these hands so her wheelchair could get up to the house I'd built, and I carried her up it myself when she was too tired even for that, and I would trade every year I have left for one more morning of her on that porch. She passed on a Thursday in spring. The last thing she said to me, clear and certain, holding my hand, was, "You take care of yourself now, Russ. Don't you let anybody tell you this isn't your home. You built it. It's yours." I thought she was just being sweet. A dying woman comforting her husband. I understand now that Maggie knew her son better than I did, and she was trying to warn me. She knew exactly what was coming. She just didn't have the strength left to stop it. So she did the one thing she could. She told me the truth and prayed I'd remember it when I needed to. I needed to 3 weeks later at her funeral with an eviction notice in my hand. I want to tell you what I felt standing by that coat closet, because it's the part people get wrong. They expect rage. There wasn't any, not yet. What I felt was a terrible, quiet clarity, like the moment a saw blade finally bites true into the wood. I looked at Derek's face, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, and I saw a stranger wearing his features, and I understood that the man in front of me genuinely believed he was about to take my home, and that he felt entitled to it, and that he had no idea, none at all, what he was actually holding. So I did what a quiet man does. I folded the notice and I put it in my jacket pocket, and I said, "All right, Derek, we'll talk about it." And I watched relief and a little contempt move across his face, the look of a man who thinks the hard part is over. And I went home, to my home, and I sat on the porch I built, and I waited until the grief settled enough for me to think. And then I started, very quietly, to take my life back. The first thing I did was nothing. That's the hardest thing for people to understand about how I handle a fight, and it's the most important. I did nothing for a week. I let Derek and Brooke believe the notice had worked, that the old man was going to go quietly. Because a man who thinks he's already won stops being careful. And I needed them careless. In that week, Derek got bold. He stopped by the house, uninvited, and walked through it with the air of a man taking inventory of property he already owned. He stood in my living room, the room where I'd taught him to build, birdhouse at the kitchen table, 40 feet away, and he said, "Brooke thinks we can get $450 for it. Maybe more if we clear the lot. There's a builder interested in my house to clear the lot. He was going to tear down the house I built with my hands and sell the bare land, and he said it to my face in my own living room, certain I had no say in the matter. I just nodded. "Is that right?" I said, and he took my quiet for surrender. What he didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I'd driven into town and sat down across the desk from Jim Foley. Jim and I go back 50 years. He's a lawyer now, a good one, but before that he was the kid down the road who I taught to bait a hook. When I laid it all out for him, the notice, the builder, the $450, Brooke's nice paper, Jim listened the way old friends listen, all the way to the end, without interrupting once. Then he was quiet for a moment. He looked at me for a long moment across that desk, and he said, "Russ, tell me something. Who bought that land?" "I did," I said. "Before you married Maggie?" "Year before I ever met her." Jim leaned back in his chair, and a slow smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who has seen this exact kind of grief and greed too many times and has just watched it run head first into a wall it didn't know was there. "Then I think," he said, "your stepson just made the biggest mistake of his life." He explained it to me plain. A man cannot inherit what his family never owned. Maggie had lived in that house for 28 years, but living in a house and owning it are two different things, and the house had never once belonged to her. It couldn't pass through her estate because it was never in it. Derek wasn't evicting me from anything. He couldn't. You can't evict a man from his own house. He'd just been so certain of his own story that he never thought to read the one document that mattered. "Go home," Jim told me, "and get that fireproof box out of your closet and bring me everything in it." I went home and I opened the fireproof box, the one Maggie always teased me for, the one I'd kept current for 40 years out of a carpenter's habit of keeping his papers square. And there it all was. The original deed, Russell J. Calloway, 1985. The land purchase records. The building permits I'd pulled in 1986. In my name for a house I was constructing as the sole owner. 40 years of property tax bills, everyone addressed to me alone. The whole history of that house, in black and white, and not one piece of paper in that box had Derek's name on it, or Maggie's either. The house had never, for one single day, belonged to anyone but me. Derek's entire plan rested on a thing he'd simply assumed. He assumed that because his mother lived in that house for 28 years, it was the family home, and that when she died, it passed to her family, meaning him. He'd never once looked at the deed. Why would he? In his mind, the house was his mother's, and his mother's things were now his, and the old man was just a leftover. He'd built his whole campaign, the notice, the builder, the 450, on a foundation of nothing but his own contempt for me. But there was a second thing, and this is the one that turned my grief into something colder and more useful. Because Derek had also told the family and told me that Maggie's will left everything to him. And I realized, sitting there with my deed in my hands, that I had never actually seen Maggie's will. Derek had handled her affairs in those last weeks. Derek had dealt with the lawyer. Derek had told us all what it said. So I asked Jem to find out what it really said. It took some doing because Derek had used a different lawyer, a young one over in the county seat, and he'd been the one to file everything. But a will is a legal document, and an executor doesn't get to hide it from the beneficiaries. And Jim Foley has been practicing law in these mountains for 40 years and knows where every bone is buried. Within 2 weeks, we had a certified copy of my wife's last will and testament. And it did not say what Derek told us it said. It didn't say it at all. Maggie's will left her own modest savings, about $40,000 she'd put away over the years, to be split between Derek and a small fund for his daughter, my granddaughter Ellie. That part Derek had been happy to mention. But the will said something else too, in a paragraph Derek had never read aloud to anyone. It said, and I'm going to quote my wife exactly, because these are the last words she left in the world. The house and land at the end of Callaway Road belongs solely to my husband, Russell, who built it with his own hands before I ever knew him. It is not mine to give, and never was. I ask my son Derek to honor this, and to look after Russell as Russell looked after him, to look after Russell as Russell looked after him. She knew. My Maggie knew exactly what her boy might do, and she'd put it in writing in her own will, a warning and a plea from beyond the grave. And Derek had read that paragraph. The executor of her estate had read his own mother's dying wish that he take care of me, and 3 weeks later, he'd handed me an eviction notice at her funeral. He hadn't just lied about the house. He'd read his mother's last request to protect me, and he'd chosen to do the precise opposite, and he'd counted on me being too broken by grief to ever find out. There was more. Tucked into the lawyer's file, sealed, was an envelope in Maggie's handwriting addressed to me. A letter she'd left with her will. Derek, as executor, had been holding it, and had never given it to me. I'll tell you what was in it later, because I didn't read it until the day everything came to a head, and that's where it belongs in the story. While I was quietly building my case, Derek was loudly building his, and I only knew how loudly because of Maggie's sister, Ruth. Ruth had never liked Derek's coldness toward me, and she'd loved her sister fiercely, and about a month after the funeral, she drove out to the house, sat down on my porch, and told me what was being said in town. Derek had been telling people, the church, the neighbors, the family, that poor Russ had lost the thread after Maggie died, that he was refusing to leave the family home, that the kids were trying to handle it gently, but the old man was being difficult about the estate. He'd built a whole story where he was the patient son and I was the confused, stubborn burden. He'd even told people he was worried about my mind. "He's getting ahead of it, Russ," Ruth said. "He's making sure that when you fight back, everyone already thinks you're the crazy one. That's not grief. That's a plan." And then she told me the part that made my hands go still on the arms of my chair. She'd driven past the house a week earlier and seen a truck in the yard, and Derek and Brooke carrying boxes out. They'd let themselves in while I was at Maggie's grave, and they'd started clearing out Maggie's things, her clothes, her books, the china, bagging up my wife to get ahead of the sale. Ruth had a photo on her phone of Brooke loading Maggie's sewing machine into the truck. Maggie's mother's sewing machine. I looked at that photo for a long time. They hadn't just decided to take my house. They were already gutting it, already dividing my wife's life into keep and sell and toss while I was standing at her headstone. They were that sure, that careless, that certain the old man would never do anything but grieve. "Ruth," I said, and my voice was very steady, "I'm going to need you to do something hard. I need you to keep letting Derek think I'm the confused old man who can't fight back. Can you do that for me?" She looked at me a long moment, and then something settled in her tired face, the same steel her sister had, and she said, "Maggie always said you were the quietest, dangerous man she ever met." I never knew what she meant till right now, and she almost smiled. Derek made his boldest move about a week after that, and it's the one that told me everything about who he'd become. He came by the house with a single sheet of paper and a pen, and he was gentle about it, almost kind, the way you're kind to someone you've decided is simple. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught him to build that birdhouse, and he slid the paper over and said, "Russ, I talked to a lawyer, and the cleanest way to do this, so there's no probate mess, is you just sign this quitclaim. It transfers the property to me, saves everybody the legal headache, and then we handle the sale and get you set up somewhere nice. It's just a formality. Mom would have wanted it simple, a quitclaim deed." He was asking me to sign my own house over to him with a pen at my own kitchen table, betting that the confused old man wouldn't know what he was signing. He'd even circled the line for me. And the thing is, by then I had already been to Jim Foley. I already had my deed out of the fireproof box. I knew sitting there that this single piece of paper was the whole game, that if I signed it I'd hand him for free the one thing he could never take by force. And I want you to know, I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, out of something close to wonder, that the boy I raised could sit at that table, under that mantel where the birdhouse photo used to hang, and try to trick his father out of his home with a circled line and a borrowed pen. But I didn't laugh, and I didn't tell him what I knew. I just picked up the paper, and I let my hand shake a little more than it needed to, and I said, "This is a lot, son. Let me have somebody look it over first. My eyes aren't what they were." And I watched the flicker of irritation cross his face, quickly hidden, and he said, "Sure, Russ." No rush, in a voice that meant there was very much a rush. He left thinking the old man was slow but cooperative, that the signature was as good as got. He had no idea he'd just shown me the exact shape of his plan and handed me the proof of it, in his own handwriting circled. Now I want to be honest about something, because if I'm not, you'll think I'm a colder man than I am. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, when I almost gave it all up. Not because of the house, because of Ellie. Ellie is 7. She's Derek and Brooke's girl, my step-granddaughter, and she has called me Grandpa Russ since before she could walk. She used to ride on my shoulders out to the workshop and hand me nails one at a time, very seriously, like it was the most important job in the world. She is the best thing those two people ever made, and I love her with everything that's left in me. And Derek knew it. So when he started to sense that the old man wasn't packing his bags as expected, he came by one evening, and he stood on my porch, and he said the cruelest thing anyone has ever said to me. He said, "You know, Russ, Ellie doesn't need confusion in her life right now. If you're going to make this difficult, make all this ugly, I think it's best she doesn't come around for a while. Kids pick up on tension." He smiled when he said it. He was telling me that if I fought for my home, he'd take my granddaughter away from me. He'd found the one thing I couldn't replace, and he held it over my head like a hammer. And I almost folded. I sat on that porch after he left, and I thought, it's just a house. It's wood and nails. I could go live in a little apartment in town, and I could keep Ellie. And what does an old man need with 4 acres and a workshop? I had the deed. I had the will. I had everything I needed to win, and I nearly threw it all away to keep a little girl in my life, because that's what love does. It finds the soft place and it makes you want to surrender. That was the night I finally opened Maggie's letter. Jim had gotten it released to me that week, and it had been sitting on my kitchen table for 2 days, because I couldn't bear to open it. But that night, with Derek's threat still hanging in the air, I opened it, and in my wife's own handwriting, shaky near the end but unmistakably hers, she'd written, "My dearest Russ, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I'm so sorry to leave you in that quiet house. I know my son. I have always known him, even when I couldn't fix him. He will try to take what isn't his, and he will use the people you love to do it, because that is the weak and frightened thing in him that I could never reach. Don't let him, Russ. Not for my sake, not for Ellie's. A man who teaches, a child that bullying works, has not protected that child. He has ruined her. The kindest thing you can do for our granddaughter is to show her, just once, that a good, quiet man cannot be moved off of what is right. Stand your ground, my love. You built that house. You built that boy, too, as much as anyone could. Now build one last true thing, and let it be the truth. I love you, Maggie. I read it 3 times. And the soft place in me, the place Derek had found and pressed on, it didn't go away, but something stronger grew up around it, like a callus over a wound. My wife had reached out of the grave to stiffen my spine, and I was not going to fail her, and I was not going to fail that little girl by teaching her that the way to get what you want is to threaten the people who love you. The next morning I called Jim Foley, and I said, "Set the meeting, and bring everything." Here's the thing about Derek. He'd been demanding a family meeting for weeks to finalize the arrangements, meaning the sale, meaning my removal. He wanted to sit me down with Brooke and pressure me into signing something, anything, to make the house theirs. He thought a formal meeting was his weapon. So I let him have his meeting. I just changed who else would be in the room. We met at Jim Foley's office. Derek came in his good shirt. Brooke beside him with a leather folder of paperwork, the picture of a couple about to close a deal. They'd even brought the builder, a man named Coyle, who wanted to clear my lot, because Derek was so certain of how the day would go that he'd brought the buyer to the signing. I sat on the other side of the table next to Jim, quiet, an old man in a flannel shirt, and I watched Derek's confidence fill the room. Derek started right in. He slid his folder across the table, and he said, "Russ, I know this is hard, but it's time to make it official. The house is part of Mom's estate. I'm the executor, and we've got a fair offer. You'll get a place in town, we'll help you move, and everybody walks away okay. Fair, help you move. The performance of a generous man for the benefit of the builder and his wife." I didn't say anything. I looked at Jim, and Jim Foley, 50 years my friend, opened his own folder, and he started laying papers on the table, one at a time, face up, sliding them toward Derek. He didn't raise his voice. A quiet lawyer is so much worse than a loud one. First, the deed. "This is the deed to the property at the end of Callaway Road," Jim said. "Recorded in 1985. Sole owner, Russell Callaway. You'll notice the date. That's a year before Russ met your mother, Derek. The house was never part of any estate but Russ's own. It was never your mother's to leave, and it is most certainly not yours to sell." I watched the color start to go out of Derek's face. Brooke reached for the deed, read it, and set it down too carefully, and I saw her do the math. The same math she'd done on what the lot would fetch, except now the number was 0. Then the building permits. The tax records, 40 years of them, in my name. The land purchase. Jim laid my whole life on that table, the proof in black and white that I had owned that ground before. Derek was old enough to ride a bike, and with every page the builder Coyle shifted in his seat and started to understand that he'd been brought to buy something the seller didn't own. "Mr. Coyle," Jim said mildly, "I'd hate for you to put down a deposit on a property the gentleman across from you has no legal power to sell. You understand my concern." Coyle understood. Coyle understood very well. And then Jim laid down the will. Maggie's real will. And he read that paragraph out loud in his flat lawyer's voice. The paragraph Derek had hidden. "The house and land belong solely to my husband, Russell. It is not mine to give and never was. I ask my son Derek to honor this, and to look after Russell as Russell looked after him." The room went dead silent. Brooke's leather folder sat closed in front of her, useless. The builder cleared his throat and said, very quietly, that he thought he'd best be going, and nobody stopped him, and we all listened to his footsteps go down the hall, and the front door closed behind the $450,000 Derek had been so sure of. And Derek stared at his mother's words on the table, the words he'd read weeks ago and chosen to bury, and for the first time since the funeral, the contempt was gone from his face, and what was left underneath, it was just a frightened man who'd been caught. He tried the way they always try. He said there must be some mistake. He said Mom hadn't been in her right mind when she wrote it. And Jim said evenly that the will had been witnessed and notarized, and that Derek himself had filed it as executor, so he'd have a hard time arguing. His own mother was incompetent on a document he'd submitted to the court. Derek said the house had always been the family home. Like saying it again might make the deed change. Brooke put her hand on his arm to stop him, because Brooke at least had finally read the room, but he shook it off and kept going smaller and smaller, until he said the thing that I think he'd believed his whole life without ever saying it out loud. That house should be mine. I grew up in it. You were never even really, and he stopped himself, but we all heard where the sentence was going. I let him run out of words the way you let a saw run out before you set it down. And then I spoke for the first time in that meeting, and I kept my voice as quiet as I've kept it my whole life. Derek, I said, I taught you to ride a bike on the road that house sits on. I paid for your braces and your college, and I walked you down the aisle because your daddy was gone and I was the one who stayed. I never once made you call me father. I just tried to be one. I slid Maggie's letter across the table, not to give it to him, just so he could see his mother's handwriting. Your mom asked you to look after me. She wrote it down because she knew you. And 3 weeks after we buried her, you handed me a piece of paper at her funeral and tried to take the house I built with my hands. And when that didn't scare me, you threatened to keep my granddaughter away from me to make me fold. I stood up. You were right about one thing all those years, I said. Blood didn't make me your father. I chose it. Every single day for 30 years I chose it. And a man who chooses can also, finally, choose himself. The house is mine. It always was. You're going to tear up that eviction notice, and you're going to go home, and you're going to think hard about the kind of man your daughter is watching you become. I didn't yell. I have never once in my life needed to yell. I'd like to tell you Derek broke down and apologized, and we all wept and made up. That's not what happened, and I won't lie to you to make it pretty. Derek left that office angry, the particular fury of a man humiliated by his own greed, and he didn't speak to me for a long while. Brooke spoke to me even less. There was no warm reconciliation. Some doors, once a man walks through them, don't open again the same way, and Derek had walked through one at his mother's funeral with an envelope in his hand. But here's what did happen, and it's the part that matters. I kept my house. I'm sitting on the porch I built as I tell you this. The eviction notice is in my fireproof box now, right next to the deed, because I'm a carpenter and I keep my papers square, and because some things you keep to remember exactly who showed you who they were. And I kept Ellie. That's the piece I fought for, in the end, more than the wood and the nails. Because here's the thing about Derek's threat, the thing he didn't count on. When you stand your ground against a bully, you don't just win the fight in front of you. You teach everyone watching that the bully can be stood up to. It took time, and it took Jim Foley making very clear, in legal terms, that a grandfather has standing too, and that a man who'd just been caught hiding a will and forging a path to a fraudulent sale was in no position to be picky about visitation. But Ellie comes up that gravel road again now. She still hands me nails one at a time very seriously, out in the workshop, and one day, when she's old enough, I'm going to tell her the whole story. Last Saturday, she found the crooked birdhouse on the shelf in my workshop, the one her daddy built when he was 9. She asked who made it. I told her your daddy did, when he was a little younger than you, and he was so proud of it. She turned it over in her small hands the same careful way he used to, and she said it was the best birdhouse she'd ever seen. And she asked if we could build one together. So we cleared off the workbench, and I showed her how to measure twice and cut once, and her little hands could barely work the clamp. We're not done with it yet. It's crooked as a country road. And when it's finished, I'm going to put it right up on that shelf next to her father's, because whatever Derek became, that boy who built the first one was real, and I helped make him, and I won't pretend that part away just because of how the rest turned out. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a father by choice. The choosing doesn't stop just because the child breaks your heart. I still hope, somewhere down that gravel road, Derek finds his way back to the boy who fell asleep against my arm. I'm not holding my breath, but the door's not locked. It's just no longer a door he can walk through carrying an envelope. Maggie was right the way she was right about most things. The kindest thing I ever did for that little girl wasn't keeping the peace. It was showing her, just once, that a good quiet man cannot be moved off of what is right. I built that house with my own 2 hands in 1986. Derek thought a house is something you inherit. He never understood that a home is something you build. And I built mine twice. Once out of lumber and sweat, when I was a young man with nothing but a piece of land and a future. And once at the end of a table in a lawyer's office, the day I finally stopped letting the people I loved tell me what I was worth. He thought he inherited a house. He forgot one simple thing. You can't inherit what never belonged to your family in the first place. They buried my wife. They tried to bury me. Instead, they buried their own plan.